I'm sure most of you have been following the news about the U.S. and Syria sort of clumsily engaging each other in dialogue after suffering from some of the worst relations in the, I'd say, the history of the two countries. Of course, things were very bad in the 1980s, but that's another discussion. But it's very important to point out that the most recent meetings are the product of a lot of talks which have been going on sort of behind closed doors and off in the shadows over the last couple of years. And around the time when Barack Obama was elected president, for those of us that were covering, sort of engaging Syria, it wasn't looking too good. Not because, of course, President Obama had not talked about engagement with Syria and Iran and other countries with whom the United States has problems. He had done plenty of that. But a mere 2 days after President Obama was elected, a member of the U.S.-Syria working group, which is sort of people who are approved by the Assad regime to have dialogue with the United States and with the American private sector, issued a blast in an article, and it was entitled 10 Things Abu Hussein Must Do in Order to be Greeted in Damascus with Open Arms like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. Clearly laying down preconditions, some of which included, for example, a lifting of U.S. sanctions and realizing that Syria is the key to the Middle East and to solving the Palestinian problem and so on. So it wasn't looking too good, not necessarily because there wasn't dialogue going on, but because it was very clear that there was a very big gap in expectations between the two sides. And I began to think, well, how are they going to narrow this gap? Things then started to move a little closer with the recent congressional visits to Damascus. Representative Cardin, Senator Kerry, for example, made trips, and it was unclear to me exactly which way things were going to go. We heard that they were very frank discussions, but it was very interesting to sort of watch in the Arab press what kind of messages were coming out, and of course after Representative Cardin's visit, there was some pretty harsh words that came out of Damascus and said this is absolutely not the way that we are to be engaged, and we don't want to talk about certain issues. And if you're going to engage us like this, well, you might as well go somewhere else. When things really started to get closer, from a dialogue sense, Syria's reaction to Washington's announcement that acting Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs Jeff Feltman would meet with Syrian Ambassador to Washington, Ahmad Mustafa, was muted fury. Feltman, while ambassador in Lebanon, had supported the anti-Syrian March 14th coalition and had angered Damascus endlessly. I think Walid Muallim once, the foreign minister Walid Muallim, actually once offered to send Jeff on a trip to Hawaii. Is that right? Yes. To get him out of Lebanon. In the Arab press, analysts close to the Syrian regime attacked Feltman, calling him a neocon carryover from the Bush administration who was, quote, playing outside the court of his new Secretary of State. But beyond this rhetoric, what angered Damascus the most was the fact that Washington had not dropped anything from its list of issues with Damascus, including the IAEA probe into what U.S. officials now believe was a clandestine nuclear program, its support for groups on the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism, its role in Lebanon, and of course its human rights abuses. But after the meeting, both parties announced that the talks went reasonably well, which in turn led to a second round of talks last weekend in Damascus between Feltman and Walid Muallim and Feltman and Dan Shapiro, the Middle East chief on the National Security Council. Both parties announced that the talks were very constructive. At the moment, the U.S. is now considering its next step, perhaps another higher-level meeting in Damascus. At some point, a possible return of an ambassador to Damascus, although that's far from clear when that would happen, and the possible easing of U.S. sanctions on Syria in exchange for some progress. And here I'm talking about easing of sanctions on Syria, talking about, for example, not necessarily dropping, just talk about dropping sanctions, but easing in terms of export licenses and other kinds of technicalities, which would allow for goods, American goods, through the export ban to Syria that are outlined under the sanctions regulations.